Welcome to another episode of the Empowered Half Hour. I am thrilled to introduce today's guest, Dr. Rachel Harris. She is author of Swimming in the Sacred, which if you're watching the video, you're going to see in the screen. I've been reading this book and I am absolutely mesmerized and I have tons of questions. But Dr. Rachel Harris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Becca.
So real fast, before I jump into the questions, I'd like to read your bio so that the audience can get a little bit better understanding, and then we'll jump right in. Rachel Harris, PhD, is the author of Swimming in the Sacred, Wisdom from the Psychedelic Underground and Listening to Ayahuasca. A psychologist who has been in private practice for 40 years, she spent 10 years in an academic research department where she published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals and received a National Institute of Health New Investigators Award. Rachel splits her time between an island in Maine and the San Francisco Bay Area. Visit her online at www.swimminginthesacred.com. All right, Rachel,
Thank you.
welcome once again.
Thanks so much.
I want to get into it. You wrote this book, Swimming in the Sacred, and I'm absolutely mesmerized by the material and how healing the guided journeys can be, the psychedelic guided journeys can be. But I'd love to hear from you. What's your backstory? Why did you feel that it was important to share the stories of the elders? And I just want to know more. How did this book come to be, and what's the backstory?
I only interviewed women, so that was a
Yes.
personal decision. I figured I'd listened to men enough, like a half a century of listening to men. So I just wanted to interview the women. And also I felt like the women had a special relationship with the medicines that they were serving, that they were more connected to spirit realms and plant teachers. And that's how they talked, that they were more kind of permeable with the sacred world. They were more connected. And also, think about it, they're doubly silenced. They're silenced because they're women. That's a long tradition, seems to be
Yes.
continuing. And they're silenced because they're underground. They work illegally. So
Wow.
they cannot present in conferences. And they are the most experienced people in the modern world, in the Western world. I mean, certainly indigenous shamans are more experienced in their specific tradition. But for the Western world, these women have been working for years with these medicines. My criteria to interview them was that they'd been working at least 20 years underground, but really they'd been working 30 or 40 years.
Wow, that's just incredible. And
Yeah, they're really the elders.
yeah, that's I'm smiling because just the stories were so incredible and profound. What have you discovered and about the psychedelic healing experience that was maybe one of the reasons that brought this book forward? What did you want to share with the world?
Well, their way of using these medicines is quite different from the medical research approach. And I
Sure.
certainly appreciate that approach because that's how the medicines are beginning to be recognized by the government and will eventually become legal and used more for therapy purposes. But these women have a different approach, and I didn't want that lost. And certainly there's
I
a
love
whole new
that.
generation of psychedelic therapists. But what's interesting to me is these women, when I first started interviewing them, I thought they were psychedelic therapists, but they're not therapists. They're
Mm,
really priestesses. So they are very specific to the ceremony in the tradition of ancient priestesses. So they really do the ceremony. Only one or two were trained as therapists. And if you did a ceremony with one of these underground elders and you had psychological questions come up and you wanted to talk to them, they would refer you to a therapist. So they work in a very different way.
yeah, I was fascinated when I read that because it sounded like they were much more wanting to be the facilitator of your psychedelic healing journey, that specific experience, and not so much, like you said, the post of the experience. I read
That's
in your
right.
book that they would, if
Yes.
you wanted to spend more time with them, then they would invite you back for another ceremony.
Yes, that could happen. And they do a lot of energetic clearing and cleansing. That's part of a kind of a shamanic approach and tradition. And also now what's happening is psychedelic therapists are doing both the sitting, the guiding, the presence during a journey, and then they're doing the pre and post, the preparation and the so-called 2 or 3 sessions of integration, which I think is not very much. So now they're combining 2 roles, and those roles are quite different. So in other words, the gifts and skill set needed to sit in ceremony is actually quite different from the therapeutic preparation and integration stages. But now we're combining them. That's asking a lot of people. And
Yeah.
also I could add that the women elders spent years working on themselves using these medicines. And at some point they decided, and often they were in an apprenticeship relationship where they were working closely with someone who had even more experience. And that was during the 60s. And at some point they were ready to begin to work with others, and they felt, I'm willing to take the risk to work underground, which is a significant risk. Because these medicines have helped me so much, I want to help others.
Yes.
So it's quite a different setting.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm curious, just for the listeners who might be curious about a psychedelic healing journey for healing, what are some of the outcomes that has happened? Like, I know that it has really good results on, say, for instance, people with PTSD, but I would love for the listeners to get a little bit of scope around what's possible through the healing.
Well, the research is really oriented towards specific diagnoses and then a reduction of symptoms that define those diagnoses. So it's been very helpful with PTSD and depression and end of life, what's called demoralization. So
Okay.
the research is moving in those areas, but the women don't look at it that way. They don't look at symptoms. They want to see the person more alive in their life, kind of living up to their soul's purpose and having more meaning in their lives and more connection and more contribution to the community. So they have kind of a bigger vision for where these medicines can take us. And this might be my very favorite quote. This is the woman I call the eldest of the elders. She's now in her late 80s. So you can imagine how long she's been working in
Yes.
these realms. So this is about intentions. We are responsible for our intentions and our choices, responsible to ourselves and to humanity. So you get a sense of a really big vision, a big world that these women live in, and that there's a level of responsibility that far exceeds just my feeling better, even though that's very valuable because the research studies are looking at people who've been treatment resistant and they've suffered for decades, some of them. But the women working underground are working with a different population, and they're looking for intentions for the sake of humanity.
Yeah, I had the goosebumps as you read that quote. I really felt that. And
Yeah.
I believe that to be true, even in my own experience. I'd mentioned when we were talking before we went live that I'm a Kundalini yoga teacher. And in the space of bringing people into their body through movement and then through deep meditation and then deep relaxation, and with the combination of mantras and mudras, you can see a profound shift in them at the end of the hour. And then, especially anybody who comes back and does multiple sessions. And when they talk about feeling better, what they're saying are very similar things. They feel more connected to their soul or more connected to purpose. They feel like something got removed, like just got moved out of their way. So there's this very like esoteric feel to these practices, and they bring us back to that deeper meaning of who we are.
Yes. And then the women elders want to see that manifest in the person's life.
That's
And if they
beautiful.
feel somebody is stuck and they're not really moving forward in their life, they might say it's time to take a break. They won't just keep doing ceremonies. So they're
Wow.
kind of evaluating according to their conceptual framework.
Yeah, that's really cool how intentional they are in their ceremonies. Um,
Yes.
I'd love to ask you another question. In preparing to write this book, like you were opening up saying, A, you're going to interview women, and all these women are underground. So, what did you have to overcome to write
No,
this
it didn't
book?
work that way. It wasn't my idea. So what happened is with the publication of Listening to Ayahuasca, I met some of these women.
Oh, I
And they
see. Yes.
gradually began to talk to me. And they wanted to have a voice. They hadn't had one. And they trusted me because of the ayahuasca book and because I had been in some of the same situations back in the 60s. I'd been living at Esalen. And so they knew my background, and where I'd been was actually very similar to them. But I went a totally different path. I went to graduate school and they went underground. It's very different. But they knew who I was, and so they trusted me. So it just sort of happened organically.
I
And
love
then
that.
one person referred me to another and to another. A lot of the women, of course, were around the Bay Area in California, but not all. And they would say to me, "Well, we know everyone you interviewed." And I would say, "No, you don't." And I would say, "Do you know anyone in Maryland?" And they would say, "Where's Maryland?"
That's
So they were
hilarious.
very oriented around. And certainly California is, though, one of those centers of this kind of work.
Yeah, sure.
So one person sent me to another.
I love when things align like that organically. Like the synchronicity is just one of my favorite things to experience because it's like a fun little game in a way.
Right, it is. And in research, they call it the snowball
Oh, yeah.
method of identifying subjects. So it's one rolls into another.
So I do really applaud you for giving them a voice. When I was reading that section in the book, it's one of your opening chapters. I
Yeah.
really felt that your intention was purposeful in giving them a voice. Was there any challenge in getting this published or in facing what people might think by you bringing the topic out? Or were you just fully confident that this is the time and these women need to be heard?
Well, I was very clear these women need to be heard. I mean, think about it. They know more than anybody else about these
It's
medicines at this
profound.
point in time. But I went back to the same publisher. I went back to New World Library. So I have sort of some continuity between the two
Sure.
books.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really great.
And I'm at the age where I'll kind of say anything. I don't care anymore. I'm retired as a therapist. So there's a certain freedom for being this old.
That's awesome. And the work is so needed too. I feel very restrained. I don't know, that's just the word that's coming up, even to that these practices are illegal or frowned upon. I mean, I understand how dangerous it could be if you're unguided and things like that. But as far as it being available to people who really need access to it, I wish there was a more openness in the world.
Yeah, and that will be based on the research. And I think it's coming.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and there's actually one of the women elders who has been able to make that leap. I mean, she's still discreet and underground, but somehow through personal relationships, she's been able to train some of the therapists involved in some research studies.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
that's the beginning of a breakthrough.
Yeah. Oh, I got the goosebumps again. I feel like we're on to something.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a great story.
Yeah. Sitting in the perspective that you are now, I'm sure there's probably a couple lessons or ahas that you could share with the audience, but what is a big takeaway that you have right now or an aha that you could share with the listeners?
I would love to because this is something that I have been working on. It's a wonderful quote from the woman in Maryland who nobody knows. I thought I had it written down here, but I'm not finding it right away. But it was something about meeting everything with joy. So there's
Wow.
this level of not just acceptance, but a joyous response to being alive, to being on this planet, in this life, in this body, because the Buddhists say it's all about suffering. And so, how do we relate to when times are difficult? And how do we work with that energy involved in those challenges? And we all have them. I mean, one of the women says, nobody escapes dismemberment. And that's certainly true, one way or another. A physical body eventually has difficulties. And so, how do we meet those experiences with joy? I mean, that's quite a high bar.
It is. And I think it's a really good one to strive for. I mean, if you think about it, we're all going to experience pain, loss, suffering, and then you have the choice of how you want to respond to it. I can share with you, I've lost both my parents at separate occasions, but to complications with prescriptions medicine. My mother accidentally overdosed, and my father had a withdrawal. It was all working with doctors and stuff, so nothing like illegal use of the medications, but nonetheless, they were very traumatic and tragic. And
Yes.
today I have a very positive outlook on life. I'm pretty happy overall. And I get sometimes people question, did I deal with that pain? Did I look at it? I've said, of course I did. I had to go through it. There was no other option. But when you get
And,
to the,
we all go.
yeah, you can continue.
Go ahead.
So, but what I really loved about the aha that you shared is that for me too, joy has been a choice. I really even had to start thinking, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if this has come across in your research and what you've experienced, but before choosing joy, I kept thinking of like all the negative times or all the haunting memories. And I started purposely thinking of a good memory. And then all of a sudden, of like my parents and the times that we had. And the next thing you know, two more memories, good memories would come. And they just started multiplying the other way instead of in the negative way. And I found peace within myself to enjoy. I have a husband, I have 4 kids, I have a career in life that I love.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, there's not space for me to just feel sad all the time. Not that I dishonor my sadness, but I do strive to live a life of joy.
Yes, and that's not easy for everybody.
No,
And
it's
I
not.
started talking about this saying this is something I work on. So we all have sort of a biological set point for happiness or joy. And it's hard to move that needle. It's sort of set. So with working with ourselves, we can move it, we can boost it a little bit.
Yes.
But you have a fairly high one, I can tell already. And there is working through the grieving process and the loss and losing parents. And we all, pretty much most of us, face that at one time or another. But there's always major loss in everyone's life. And then that set point might dip for a little bit, but then it goes back up to what our biological normal is.
Yeah.
So you sort of have that gift that you're like a little bit higher than many of us. But I want to speak to those of us who are not so naturally
Yes.
high. And so there's just kind of, I don't want anyone to feel pressured that, oh, I have to be joyful all the time. There's just working with our own level of happiness and acceptance. But I
Great.
think there is a level of accepting that life, as the Buddhist position is, that life involves suffering.
Yes.
And how do we work with that?
Yeah. And I love that you said like work through it. I think that's one of the gifts of the sacred ceremony can offer is maybe readjusting that set point is kind of what I was
No, it
reading.
doesn't change. No,
It
don't
doesn't
go there.
change? No,
It's
it doesn't?
biological.
Oh,
No, you're
biological.
not going to play in the NBA. You're not 6'7". It's not going to happen.
I didn't mean it like that.
And
But
it's the same thing with the set point. I don't want people to expect that they're going to be extroverted and bubbly and
sure.
and have
Yeah.
a higher level.
They're
We all have our own level and
natural
it's making
default.
peace with
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Yes. But I think what I was more referring to, and I might have used the wrong word, is that when you put yourselves in position to do the work, like you go into ceremony and like again, I bring in the Kundalini yoga, like I have spent a lot of time in meditation and movement and moving the energy that does keep me down and heavier. So even though I might have a higher disposition, say for happiness, I didn't just rebound. I actually had to put myself
Right.
in situations to help me get back up, I guess is what I was
Yes, and
trying to
that's
say.
an important, wonderful process. It actually gives you more depth as a
Yes.
person. And that's the work of mourning. I mean, that was Freud's phrase that mourning is work. It is work.
Yeah, it
And it
is.
takes time.
It does. So let's move on to a different question. Why are you so passionate about this work?
What I'm really passionate about is what I spent my own life doing, and that's psychotherapy.
Uh-huh.
So I want to be clear that I don't think journeys or entheogenic journeys fix everything. I'm very
Sure.
big on that integration is a process that continues throughout life. And that's how these women elders work with the medicines. People might come in for a journey once a year, maybe every 6 months, or they might bring a partner or a spouse. I've sat in ayahuasca ceremonies with 3 generations of a family. And
Oh,
it's
wow.
a privilege to be with a family like that. It's really wonderful. So there are many ways to use these medicines. And I think there's a real place for psychotherapy in not just a few sessions of integration, which is what the research protocol calls for, but that there can be an ongoing process. And one of these women in conversation, I mentioned to her, they're licensed therapists who have never been in therapy. And she just could not believe it. She didn't know that was
Wow.
possible. I really am a believer in therapy assisted and working with the medicines.
Yeah,
And
that makes a lot of
the
sense.
medicines bring up very rich material. And I think we're just learning. In the States, we've been very big on psychedelic experiences using the medicines. But in Europe, for decades, they've worked with psycholytic experiences, which is a smaller dose. It's not a microdose. It's, you feel it. And it's more than what they call a museum dose, which is just fun to go to a museum or out in the woods. So it's actually, it is, you really do feel the medicines, but you still have your ego
Right.
intact.
Yeah.
You're not losing, you're not dissolving. So you're able to talk with a therapist. And that's mostly what they've done in Europe. And I think that's very valuable. And they do it within a context of a couple of years of therapy and maybe one psycholytic session a month. I mean, it's an ongoing, unfolding process. So I think as a culture, we have a lot to learn about the many ways that we can use these medicines.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I can only relate it back to my experience of all the Kundalini yoga I've done, but I did it in conjunction with therapy. So I would have these like really heightened awarenesses, maybe even spiritual experiences that gave me, like you said, more depth, more
Ah,
connection. And then that continued integration happened in my talk
yes,
therapy and stuff. So I can see
yes. Thank you
the
for
benefit
sharing
of,
that.
yeah, the benefit of both. That
Yeah,
really makes a lot of
exactly.
sense.
Yeah.
I wonder what your take is on this. And I had recently, I don't know, went to a hypnotherapy appointment a couple weeks ago, and it was my second time with her. I think she might have some shamanism to her just because the way I laid down on the floor, I had this like deep breathing experience. There was feathers and smoke, and I just loved it. It was amazing. But she called herself a hypnotherapist, which is fine. I was able to have a guided conversation, a two-way conversation with my parents, which was very profound and very needed for my own healing journey. But one of the things that they said was that part of the reason that they chose not to come back to their bodies, because they said they had choice, was that
Wow.
because they were so disconnected from their magnificence, their soul, and their radiance in this human form, that once they reconnected with it, they didn't feel that their bodies could handle them coming back. And I thought, wow, like that's a really
That's
big,
very interesting.
yeah, that was really big. So I do want to write about that in one of my upcoming books because I'm like, whoa,
Yes,
that's really cool.
please. Yeah.
But one of the things that they said was that they felt that depression really came from disconnection of the soul and the lack of the ability, or how hard it is for humans to integrate their soul into their human experience. And I don't know really that the world you're speaking of goes that far deep into the spirit world, but I was just kind of curious, when people are doing this work, is there a focus on integrating the soul into the human body?
I think a little bit back, you used the word purpose. And
Yes.
let's connect that to a soul's purpose.
Yes.
And that is part of what they're looking for when they work with people. How long ago did your parents die? Can I ask how long?
Yes, that's fine. My father passed away in 2014, and then my mom passed away in 2003.
So this is many years, and you're working on it
Still,
currently.
yes. Never,
Still. And I
yeah.
think this is really important for people to understand that we work through things differently at
Yeah.
different levels of our lives, different stages of our lives.
Yes.
And so what you're doing now is different than what you did when they first died. And I dare say it'll come up for you again
Oh, I'm sure it will.
because, yeah, I mean, this is a momentous event in all of our lives when a parent dies, and we learn from it. And you're sharing your very process of learning and mulling it over and what does this mean? And that is the process of integration. And I just want people to understand that this goes on. What else
And
is there to
on.
do in life?
And
I
on.
mean, I think this is what life is about. But I understand not everybody has this as their primary value. But I do want people to understand that this level of integration and reworking and having things, the reworking gives us a different sense of ourselves in our own lives, and that it unfolds over the whole rest of our lives, because the research protocol is to be as cost effective as possible. So they offer maybe 3 sessions of integration. I don't want people to think that's really what integration is.
Yeah.
Integration is this process that you're in of growing and unfolding and reworking and learning. And that's a beautiful example.
Yeah. Wow. Again, I have the goosebumps head to toe. That felt
Yeah.
so true. It just is resonating as true.
Yeah. And what's also not unusual during an entheogenic journey to also enter into these conversations with people who have died. And
Yeah. I was
so it's
kind of
wonderful
curious
that
about
you were
that.
able, yeah, that you were able to access that through hypnosis. So
Yeah.
you're one of those people who can move, and everything you've said fits it, that you're able to shift states of consciousness
Yeah.
fluidly.
Oh,
So you
that's
were able to move into that other realm and receive
yes.
information from your parents. It's a wonderful story.
Aw, thank you so much. And I'm looking at the timer and we're already at 30 minutes. Ah, this
Yeah.
was such a great interview. I would love, Rachel, for you to share an opportunity to tell the listeners how they can find your book and find more about you.
Well, there's a website, and it's a beautiful website, swimminginthesacred.com. And I would go there. There's a lot of information there, and some interviews will begin to appear there as well.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for coming on and being a guest. I absolutely loved our conversation
Oh,
today.
thank you. It's been really fun, Becca.
All right.